Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I am your host, Daniel Fiott, and for this 13th episode, I'm really pleased to welcome Victor Cha and Ramon Pacheco Pardo to the podcast for a discussion about Northeastern Asian security in light of President Trump's shift on Russia's war on Ukraine. Victor, well known to everyone, is president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and career chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington. And Ramon, a very good colleague with me at CSDS, holds the Korea Foundation VUB career chair. Welcome to you both, Victor and Ramon. Victor, if I can turn to you first and begin our discussion. And let me begin by asking you firstly for your thoughts on what you think the relevance of Pete Hegseth's recent tour of the Indo-Pacific is, right? So are partners such as South Korea, Japan, Philippines, and Australia ready for what a kind of peace through strength strategy in the Indo-Pacific means in practice? And what do you think was the general feeling after this visit?
Thanks for having me on the podcast. So it was a very anticipated trip. You know, Secretary Hegseth had met with NATO allies, but the Asia trip had not taken place yet. So listening very carefully to the signs of commitment by the United States to the alliances in the region, I think overall, all the right things were said with regard to maintaining a very strong posture in Japan and the Philippines and Australia vis-a-vis China, which is the so-called pacing threat for the Pentagon and its long-term strategy. But it's also noteworthy that Secretary Hegseth skipped one of the important allies in Northeast Asia, and that is Korea. And so that I think, of course, has raised some concerns, not just in Korea, but I think in other capitals, because when we think about the alliances for the United States in Asia, Korea is certainly one of them. I think in part it's a result of the political crisis in Korea, which made it really, I wouldn't say unnecessary, but a bit awkward to meet with his counterpart, who would most likely not be in office in a few weeks. But I think it also speaks to some concerns that the Trump Pentagon is really going to focus almost entirely on the China threat and Taiwan, and will look to Korea to do much of the defensive deterrence on the peninsula. And that might be one of the reasons also why he skipped South Korea. I'm not saying that's the definitive reason, but I'm sure there's some in the region who are thinking about that as well.
Thanks so much, Victor, for kicking us off and also for unpacking a little bit some of the visits that were made, some that were not, and also for reinforcing, I think, what, at least from a European perspective, seems very clear, and that's, as you stated, the China threat and the Taiwan focus. And I think it's also quite interesting what you say that nations like South Korea are at least thinking or having to think about fending for themselves. Again, quite a familiar feature even for many European ears at the moment, fending for yourself. Victor, if I can stay with you and follow up with a question as well on top of this, and I'd really like to ask for your opinion and your reflections on how you think President Trump's shift towards a peace deal with Russia, whatever that looks like, over Ukraine, is also being perceived in the Indo-Pacific, right? So do the likes of South Korea, Japan, and other allies and partners think the US of reverse Nixon over Ukraine, or trying to pull the Russians away from the Chinese? Is this a maneuver or a tactic which is gaining traction or recognition in the Indo-Pacific amongst partners? And what's the general impression of the diplomatic footprint of the US vis-a-vis Russia over Ukraine?
So I think on the one hand, all the Asian allies would like to see the war in Europe come to an end for sure. At the same time, though, I can't imagine that they took any comfort in seeing the way President Trump really worked directly with the Russians first, and then tried to present some sort of deal to Ukraine, to Zelensky. I'm sure that doesn't make allies comfortable at all, thinking that President Trump might do the same thing with Xi Jinping or with Kim Jong Un, and that's so I think that is unsettling for many. The other thing is, I think that probably uh, um, most of the Asian allies are not particularly enamored with the idea of a so-called reverse Kissinger strategy of trying to pull Russia away um, from China. Um, I think what people who remember their history will point out about Kissinger's strategy was that he tried to engage China at a time when Russia, well, then the Soviet Union and China were at odds with one another. So it had the effect of putting the United States in the pivot position, if you will, where you had bad relations between China and the Soviet Union, and the outreach, to Mao, and also the outreach to Brezhnev at the same time, and it put the United States in a sort of pivot position. This idea of a reverse Kissinger would effectively put Russia in a pivot position where it would have both the United States and China reaching out to Moscow. So I don't think it's exactly the same, and I don't think it will succeed. And I would guess that many allies in the region also have um, some reservations about it, although I'm sure that in public and in talking officially with their counterparts, they will be supportive of whatever the United States wants to try. But I think overall, I think that even here in Washington, D.C., we underestimate how Trump's interest in a peace deal uh, with Russia in Ukraine can really drive a lot of policy, not just between Russia and Ukraine and the United States, but drive a lot of policy in the world. There are striking parallels to the way President Trump dealt with North Korea in his first term in office and the way he's dealt with Russia, in the sense that he personally has invested his time and his public face and his reputation in the North Korea negotiation, the summits in Singapore and Hanoi and Panmunjom. He's doing the same thing now in the Russia case. There are many other aspects of foreign policy, reciprocal tariffs, immigration, but in terms of some sort of peace deal or a security issue, he's personally invested the time in the Ukraine conflict, just like he did with the North Korea situation. The other thing he's done is he's talked directly to the adversary first. He did that with Kim Jong Un, and he's doing that again with Russia, and raising concerns about bypassing the ally in the case of Ukraine or in the case of South Korea. And there's also, in doing this, not a lot of focus on the details. So Trump didn't really focus that much on the details of a peace deal with North Korea, and he's not so much focused on the details um, of the peace deal with Ukraine, just sort of focused on the bigger and broader picture. And then finally, um, there's this unique preoccupation with real estate that Trump has in both the cases of Ukraine and in the case of North Korea. In the case of North Korea, he kept focusing on the beaches in Wonsan as being great condo and casino property. And in the case of Ukraine, he hasn't talked about beachfront property or luxury hotels like he has about Gaza, but he has talked about the focus on critical minerals, a sort of extractive motive for the United States there as well. So some striking parallels that I'm sure allies in the region are also noticing.
Many thanks for that, Victor, and also for pointing out some of the historical lessons or differences, at least from any future or present attempt to reverse Kissinger compared to how it was during the Cold War. And also, I think it's going to be very interesting for our listeners of Strategy Speaks to also pick up on maybe some of the approaches that President Trump did try towards North Korea in his first term. And probably many of us will be rushing back to op-eds and pieces of work at that time to really study what he did in practice to learn some lessons. And I also think one of the other major points that you rightfully highlight, and that is certainly, as you know, generating a lot of concern in Europe, is the bypassing of allies and partners, right? So it's this kind of reaction to go for an adversary first discussion, as you put it. But also, I think that is probably one of the major issues which has rattled many European partners, especially, that bypassing can happen and does happen. And on that point, maybe now turning to Ramon, if possible, and thinking a little bit about how individual nations are reacting or responding to the second Trump presidency. And Ramon, I'd like to ask you, if possible, to share your views, I think, in a more general sense of how you see South Korea currently responding to the latest Trump presidency, right? I think you have written personally about this, but there's certainly been a lot of noise in the media as well about the talk of nuclear deterrence, nuclear power, etc., etc. How do you think this is also evolving in light of the second Trump presidency? And a follow-on question as well there for Ramon is that aside from the conversation in South Korea, how do you see North Korea reacting to all of this?
Well, I think that in South Korea there is concern. There is concern because, as Victor pointed out, and you mentioned yourself, Daniel, the possibility of being bypassed when it comes to a negotiation between the US and North Korea is very real. And the longer there is no political stability in South Korea, and I think political stability would mean a new president, elections, and a new president. Of course, President June would still be reinstated by the Constitutional Court, but then we would have 2 years really of instability in the sense that he would be a lame duck president with no power whatsoever. So I think the longer we have instability in South Korea, the longer the fear will be there. And I would also say at the same time that when it comes to the economic relationships between South Korea and the United States, South Korea, like many other allies and partners, has been on the receiving end of tariffs by the US. South Korea knows that it's going to have to pay more for hosting US troops. I mean, this is coming at some point. And South Korea knows that its companies are going to have to invest more in the United States, and as some of them have already announced, for example, Honda Motors. So I do think that it doesn't look good from a short-term perspective. Having said that, compared to the contempt in which Europe is being treated, I think South Korea is in a better position than other Asian countries as well, I would say, because of what you mentioned, because the Trump administration's focus is clearly China. And when it comes to deterring China, even though the three-vice Secretary of Defense has included South Korea for the reasons that Victor mentioned, but South Korea has been mentioned among the partners, among the allies, the U.S. allies that are expected to step up to support the U.S. And I don't think that South Korea has much of a choice here. I mean, it will have to step up, and it will have to cooperate more with other uh, partners and also the allies, the United States. Now, the question of North Korea is very interesting because I think North Korea has taken a wait and see approach. It hasn't been critical of the Trump administration. It hasn't closed down the door to potential resumption of high-level summits between Kim himself and Trump, but it is waiting to see what the U.S. has to offer. And I think that North Korea is in a strong position right now because obviously it has the support of Russia, this mutually beneficial relationship. It's helping Russia, of course, but it's also helping North Korea. So I think Kim Jong Un can take this wait and see approach and see at some point when we all expect that Trump will probably try to assume high level diplomacy. He likes the show business aspect of it, if it's not the policy details of it. So I think that North Korea is just going to wait and see. Also, of course, North Korea is waiting to see what happens with the probable South Korean election, because if a liberal like Lee Jae-myung were to win the potential election in South Korea, obviously the relationship between the two Koreas would also change.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ramon. And that I find that quite interesting. That idea of a wait and see approach by North Korea to also see where the chips land. And indeed, it will be very interesting to see, I think, how President Trump re-engages at that kind of top level diplomacy that you also refer to. And you also brought back as well into your response, again, this enduring fear at the moment that allies and partners can be bypassed. I guess at least in Europe, I guess also in the Indo-Pacific, in the US, there is a lot more thought being given to the connections, similarities, differences between the war in Ukraine at the moment and any potential Taiwan contingency, right? So I guess one of the main questions that I have for you is to what extent do you think the US approach to Ukraine as we're seeing it unfold, how does that inform possible US actions during any potential Taiwan contingency? So that's the first question. And the second one that I'd like to address is this, very much in terms of what Ramon said about North Korea playing a wait and see game. I guess that also applies to China as well, and China trying to study America's moves quite closely as well, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also directly in Ukraine as well. Do you think that any Taiwan play over any contingency will be entirely different, or is there anything to learn from the way the US has approached Ukraine under this second presidency?
So I think I'd make four observations. The first is that I think the war in Ukraine and Russia's difficulties in the war in Ukraine have made China realize how difficult it is, like how difficult it really is to invade another country and to completely take over it. Of course, and the big difference for China and Taiwan is they're going to have to do that over water, not over land, which makes it much more difficult. And so I think the Chinese are taking that lesson away. And I also think that in combination with Xi Jinping's lack of confidence in his military as a fighting force may delay this for a while. It doesn't delay it indefinitely, because that also means he's putting a lot of effort into making the PLA into a fighting force. But still, I think that China has learned much about how difficult such a conflict would be. The other thing I think they learned is that the war in Ukraine became multilateralized in the sense that NATO countries, the United States, even Indo-Pacific countries were playing a role. I mean, Japan has something like $18 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine, South Korea over $3 billion, in addition to everything that NATO and the United States was giving. And so this multilateralization of the conflict, making it something that the world cares about, not just the United States, also would apply equally to the Taiwan-China situation, where we have seen Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, all making much more forward-leaning statements about freedom of navigation, peace across the Taiwan Strait. I think, and I haven't seen all the readout from the trip yet. I think Hegseth's trip sends a good message in the sense that he's reaffirming U.S. commitments to Japan, to the Philippines, to Australia. The one thing I did see was that he made a commitment to the U.S. commitment to continue to establish the Joint Force headquarters with Japan, which is very important in terms of warfighting capability. There were some rumors that the Trump administration was not going to follow through with that, but I think his statement was important. But usually on a trip like this, the first trip by the defense secretary, you would see a whole rash of deliverables coming out of each stop. And I don't know, again, I haven't been following it, and I haven't seen the Pentagon's readout of it yet. But I think there have been good words, but in terms of all these deliverables, I don't know if those are showing up. And then the fourth point I would make is that while I think the United States is going to really focus on China as the pacing threat in this Pentagon, that will necessarily mean some changes in force posture for the United States in Asia. And whenever you have changes, and they could be some major changes that take place, you always worry about the risk of miscalculation, that there would be the risk of miscalculation, that North Korea or that China might see an opportunity, mistakenly see a weakening of the US commitment. And that's often how wars start, right? When countries miscalculate because they perceive a lack of commitment, or they perceive some strategic distraction by one side or the other. I know that in all of our meetings at CSIS with CSDS and with NATO, that there's intense interest in Europe with regard to a Taiwan contingency, not just because of the commercial impact, but because there's a concern that if there is a Taiwan contingency, will then Russia miscalculate or do something else in the middle of Europe? And so all of these theaters are connected, and the concern about strategic distraction or strategic miscalculation, strategic misdirection, I think puts everybody on concern about trying to work together to maintain deterrence and defense.
Thank you, Victor, for those 4 points. And I think particularly the last one is the one that certainly needs a lot of work, but is also the most worrying. This potential for miscalculation, misreading of events, of the situation, of the context. And that, of course, is something which probably reinforces the idea of, partners, not just the US, but partners and allies across both theaters, both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, also showing some resolve and seriousness about how they develop their own defenses as well. So I think as time goes by, we probably want to reduce as much as possible any room for miscalculation. But as you know better than most people, Victor, the way that these theaters are now interconnected and what we learn from each theater, I think is not just interesting from an academic and think tank point of view, but even from a policy and strategic view as well. So on that note, I wanted to thank you both, Victor and Ramon, for joining me for this 13th episode of Strategy Speaks. I think we covered a lot of ground in a very, very short time, wrapping up the first initial moves of the current Trump administration in the Indo-Pacific and its approach elsewhere to Russia and China. So thank you, Victor and Ramon, for walking us through some of these very interesting and sensitive discussion points. Thanks also to our audience for tuning in once again, and please do join us for the next episode of Strategy Speaks. Thank you.